this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode we'll be examining the 6th Airborne Division and its combat effectiveness, focusing on how its commanding officer, Richard Gale, meticulously trained and developed the unit, and it would first see action during the Normandy invasion. Gale's leadership and the culture he instilled were crucial in shaping the airborne soldiers' capability and forging the division into a cohesive fighting force. Joining me is Andrew Wheale. Andrew is the author of Ham and Jam, 6th Airborne Division in Normandy, Generating Combat Effectiveness, November 1942, September 1944. Andrew, welcome. Let's start by setting the scene with the British Airborne. Compared to the Germans, the British are late to the show. The Germans had successfully used airborne troops to capture the fortress at Eben-Emael. They've been used en masse to capture Crete. Kurt Student was very much the driving force from the German perspective, but were the British heading in the same direction with their thinking?
With my research, a key moment is the 1936 Kiev manoeuvres, when Archie Wheale goes to see what the Russians are doing. And if you look at the papers in Q, he's really going to look at Russian tanks. He's very interested in the Russian tanks. And then over his head, all this airborne enthusiasm opens. And he's not that interested. It's like a footnote. And if you do find those papers in Q, it's really interesting. There's probably more type dedicated to can he wear his Tsarist medals and awards at the dinner, or will that offend the Soviets, over the airborne force element, really, which is really interesting. So we kind of put them on the back burner.
Had he just written it off? Had he just sort of suggest, because he's also writing the British training manual in the 30s as well, so he's very influential as Wheale. Had he just sort of put a line underneath them and said, well, I don't think we need them?
I think so. I mean, the tank mechanisation, firepower, that's kind of like where they're at. And then I think, obviously, World War II break. Well, the Americans obviously the Germans take a completely different point of view, because Student went to some of those exercises as well. And they very quickly assembled a very, very coherent airborne force under Student's leadership. And that was doubly interesting because Student, before his airborne job, had been involved in the development of a lot of the Luftwaffe aircraft types. And the Junkers 52 had been a kind of a default for quite a while. The Junkers 52 also had the advantage that it did look quite a lot like a commercial passenger plane, which was part of its sort of cover story. So when they developed all the Messerschmitts, the Heinkels, the Junkers, they still had all these Junker 52s. And they had this very large fleet of Junker 52s at the start of World War II. Obviously, it was woven in. And if you read Guderian's book on, Blitzkrieg, Achtung Panzer, it's woven into their, and we'll use airborne forces to do X, Y, and Z. And then, obviously, Eben-Emael happens, which is a huge, brilliant result. But prior to that, they'd seized these airfields in Denmark and Norway. We can talk about coup de main obsession in a bit. But I think an obsession of coup de main starts at that point. A great weight is added when Anthony Eden, he forms the Home Guard really on the back of the fret of airborne troops. It looks like Perry and Croft kind of script, because it all sounds a bit like, it's like Dad's Army, Nazi paratroopers dressed as nuns, landing in Mrs. Brown's toilet and all that sort of business. But that was what formed, that was the key thrust of the formation of the Home Guard, the threat of German airborne forces. And then you move forward to January, February 1941, and something that I found really interesting was Brooke. Alan Brooke is in charge of Home Forces, and he has this enormous anti-invasion exercise called Exercise Victor, which basically exercises all the troops up and down the country. And he has this amazing prediction of German airborne forces, 15 regiments of German paratroopers, there's glider landing tanks that they've got to be ready for. And all the forces up and down the country have to be ready for this massive German airborne threat.
Was that after Crete, or was that before Crete?
That was about 3-4 months before Crete.
Interesting, he's thinking that before Crete, then Crete happens and takes everyone by surprise in such fast numbers.
That's the thing. Churchill had called in July 40 for the formation of an airborne force. they turned one of the commando battalions into the 1st Special Air Service Battalion. But then Crete happens, and the terrible thing about Crete is they knew it was coming, thanks to Bletchley Park. And there's 50,000 Commonwealth troops on Crete, commanded by Freiburg, with tanks dug in, all sorts, with supporting Greek forces. The place is not good terrain-wise for an airborne landing. It's rocky, there's walls everywhere. All the locals are fanatically anti-German, but the Germans still managed to bring it off. If you read Churchill's war memoirs, there's this terrible sort of cold shower moment where he recalls this conversation he had with Brooke. And Brooke said, well, all they're going to do now is they're going to fill up Crete with bombers, and they're going to make the Royal Navy's presence in Alexandria completely untenable, and we're in real trouble now. And then there was the numbers game, like 7th Flieger Corps and all this sort of stuff, because they assumed that the Germans had masses of more airborne troops. And you read Brooke's memoir, Brooke's papers, when they were recently, well, not that a while ago, published, and he actually says, I'm firmly convinced of the value of these forces. And he's absolutely nailed on. Brooke is such a fantastically interesting character who gets very little press and print compared to Montgomery. He's actually not a fan of what he calls special forces. He's not a fan of people blacking up with a knife between their teeth. He doesn't like it. And he actually says at points, well, I don't understand why each division doesn't have like a trench raiding company, as we had in the Great War, with specially selected troops to do this kind of reconnaissance assault. But he's completely convinced of airborne forces. And then, we get into the formation of British Airborne Forces. They formed the 1st Parachute Brigade, and then obviously the selection of Gale as the first commander of that. And there's other candidates for that job. And then, off we go.
Well, I was going to say, why is Gale selected? Well, let's maybe perhaps rather than why Gale selected, you look at his First World War service, which might possibly give some indication of why he's selected. Because he fights through the First World War. He's there throughout the whole thing.
Absolutely. I obviously, I'm very fond of Windy Gale because he is an interesting guy. Anybody who's interested in British Airborne Forces should try and read his 2 books. You've got to read Call to Arms, which is military autobiography, and you should obviously read with 6th Airborne Division in Normandy. But he's quite self-effacing when he talks about his World War I experience. Essentially, he wanted to be a regular soldier, and he actually failed like initial selection because he was unfit. And so he basically trained, and then he went through Sandhurst at the very start of World War I and was commissioned as a regular in the Worcester Regiment. And then this amazingly weird thing happens where he's out on the Western Front and he's told to go to this sort of training course presentation on machine guns. And when he gets there, he discovers he's been transferred to the new machine gun corps. So he's been sort of promoted sideways. And he's got quite a sort of charming, bemused tone to his writing in his biography when you read about that. Then he fights through World War I in the Machine Gun Corps. He was awarded the MC in 1918. He's awarded the MC for conducting a very effective defence with machine gun fire. And then he goes forward and he uncouples dead and dying horses, so some guns are able to be dragged back. So he's personally courageous. And then as you go into the interwar period, he does staff college in India. And he's out in India for quite a while. And then, fast forwarding a little bit, basically, as the Machine Gun Corps is disbanded, he goes back, he reverts to the Worcesters. And he ends up in 2nd Division in 1936, whose commanding officer is Wheale. And in the same time, he actually goes out to see the airborne manoeuvres at Kiev. So there's a sort of a moment of intersection, yeah? When Alan Brooke is the director of military training, Gale is working on pamphlets, and he actually persuades Brooke to include Tiny Ironside in a discussion about artillery and infantry. And I think that's quite something because, if you know anything about Alan Brooke, he's quite a spiky character. And he persuades Brooke to include Tiny Ironside as part of this sort of process at one point. So by that point, by the pre-war period, he's encountered Wheale and Brooke and Ironside. From his following career, you can see he was a very capable individual. But then at the time of the war breaking out in 1939, he was working on the war plan, capital W, capital P, which was basically the big plan to mobilise everybody to recreate the army of 1918 by the end of 1941 and then just stuff their way into Germany. That was the plan, with the French. But obviously that didn't come off. So that all falls apart, and he rushes off to become CO of 2nd, 5th Leicesters, who were a TA battalion. And obviously, at this point, it's all hands to the pump, and like the British Army's frantically generating infantry battalions and infantry divisions to just block the coast effectively. So he's in a good position at that point. And then when they're looking for somebody for 1st Parachute Brigade, there are 5 other candidates, apparently. And one of them was KP Smith, who ended up in charge of 185 Brigade in Normandy. And there was another guardsman, apparently, who was involved, who was a possible candidate, but Gale got it.
Because it's notable that Gale's not there with the BAF in 1940, unlike Monty and Alex. I did wonder, I don't know, it was when they're forming the brigade, is it Brooke who's making the decision who's going to be CO to essentially craft this new unit?
I think so. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, there's a lot of fingers in the sort of the airborne pie. I mean, Paget was very important. He's another general who gets absolutely no coverage whatsoever. Yeah. But I mean, Southern Command turned into 21st Army Group for Monty to take it over the Channel. Paget's involved. I think Dill's involved as well. I think Dill's got a lot to do with it. But he gets the job, and presumably because he's forward thinking. I think the fact that he'd obviously taken to the machine gun corps, he shows he's very open to new ideas and new techniques. Gale's very much he's a very interesting sort of military character, the way he presents. Because if you look at the cover of my book, that's kind of what his presentation was to his young soldiers. He's wearing his Denison smock, he's got a fag in his hand, he's got his enormous artillery binoculars. And he actually says at one point, "My name is Richard Gale, I'm a professional soldier." And it's like, "I've done it all before, you don't need to worry." But then there are photographs of Gale when he's working at the War Office in the Air Directorate, and he looks like Eisenhower. He's very urbane, tailored red tabs uniform. So I think he's very much, I don't want to say clubbable. I think he's a good communicator at every level. And then, I mean, there's so much you can talk about Gale, because post-war, his career explodes after the end of the war. He's in Palestine. He's the commander of 1st Division, which is obviously a very prestigious command. And then he goes off and he ends up being commander of the northern group of NATO armies in Europe. And then he ends up being the deputy land commander under the Americans. He retires, and the Americans actually ask for him to come back, which is extraordinary, which, you know, is right up there with like the full honours funeral for Dill in Washington when he passed away. You know, he was a British general that they really liked. The Americans did. He's a very good communicator. I think he's a diplomat. I mean, it's interesting, Lord Lovat, in his book, March Past, he said that he thought Gale had he was a red-faced, loud, hectoring voice. But Lovat, who's obviously a very different personality, he actually came to respect Gale a great deal. So it's interesting. I mean, I think he could certainly sort of move through the gears. So he'd obviously made a very good impression on a lot of these people, which helped him get the job.
I did wonder as well, because he'd been there right at the end of the last 100 days, and he gets his MC, is it, in as part of Operation Michael, that great finish to the war of the British Army. I wondered if that had opened his eyes, and that might be why he puts his hat in the ring to some extent for the Parachute Brigade. But that brings us to, what do they think when they set up the Parachute Brigade? Is it going to be? Is it a coup de main force, or is it, well, if they've only got 4,000 in, it's not quite going to be doing Crete, are they, with it? It's kind of too big for one and not big enough for the other.
Well, that's the problem. This is it. When I did my research for my PhD, which fed into my book, I had a huge moment of horror at the National Archive when I realised I had to look at all the RAF records as well as the Army records. So I was extremely naive not realising that before. But you realise that it is kind of like it's a bit of an orphan, Airborne Forces is, because it's entirely reliant on the RAF to get it to where it needs to be. And they're not keen. I think they're not enthusiastic. I think it's fair to say the RAF are lukewarm about Airborne Forces. And there is a great dispute, which I mentioned in the book, which comes to a head in November 42. And basically, Alan Brooke just lies, uses his force personality to make sure that the Airborne Division, 1st Airborne Division, stays in existence, because there is this great cost. But coming back to your point about what was it for, if you look at the first doctrine documents, there is this fascination with coup de main and seizing airfields. I think it was this idea that they could seize airfields because they'd seen the Germans do it and how devastating an effect, like the capture of Malimi airfield the airfields in Denmark and Norway, which had just paralysed the Danish and Norwegian defence. And they were, we could use it as this key. And then at the same time, wouldn't it be great if we could do it on the cheap? We'll do it with gliders and they can be towed by the RAF's bombers. And like the RAF at the time went, well, yeah, maybe, that was kind of their response. I think it gets serious when like Brooke appoints Boyd Browning to be the divisional commander, because I think any relevant military force has to be a division in World War II if you're going to do anything serious. And that's when it starts getting serious. And I almost think that Brooke appointed Boyd Browning really because I think he probably sensed that Boyd Browning could have been a problem for airborne forces, because Boyd Browning was a soldier going places and he was like the ultimate guardsman, Boyd Browning was. But put him in charge of it, and then obviously, the boot's on the other foot, and Boyd Browning fought the corner hard for airborne forces all the way through World War II. But I mean, it is interesting. And of course, there is $1 million question that is very rarely mentioned or asked. Because bearing in mind the Fallschirmjäger were part of the Luftwaffe, what would have happened if they'd put airborne forces badged with the RAF? Because later in the war, you've got the RAF regiment.
I suspect Bomber Harris would have converted them all to Lancaster crews and had them flying over Berlin.
He probably would have let them fire Sten guns out the door, if they made them happy. But they'd have to fly with Lancasters probably. I think after Crete, they knew what they wanted. I think it was like, oh my God, look what they've done. They've just chased Freiburg and 50,000 Dominion troops out of Crete. It's like, God, what next? And they're still concerned. I often think it's interesting trying to spot when they stop worrying about Operation Sea Lion. And I always think a moment when they stop worrying about Sea Lion is November 42, because that's when the Guards Armoured Division moves from the south coast to Yorkshire to start driving around its tanks. And I think they were worried for a long, long time about Sea Lion. And they were so worried about what airborne forces could potentially do to them. And they wanted some of that.
When Gale's put in charge of that first parachute brigade, what type of recruit is he looking for? How much is he able to sort of pick and choose what he gets?
This is interesting. There's all sorts of stories about them getting guys into a room and they'd ask them a question about their mother, and then they'd basically insult their mother. And if the guy stood up and he looked like he was about to have a pop, he instantly became an NCO. There's all these stories, about this sort of stuff. And maybe it's true, but certainly if you read John Frost's books, there was a real problem with a lot of units unloaded a lot of unsuitable guys. They kind of got them to go to the parachute regiment. Why don't you join the parachute regiment? To get them out of the door, really. So that was a problem. But they were looking for fit soldiers. They were looking for keen soldiers. They were looking for people who wanted to fight. And from my research, the key reason why people joined airborne forces was essentially that term browned off. I went to the Second World War Experience Centre in Yorkshire and looked at all their records. I looked at all the commando and airborne records. And in the main, I did like a grid. I did a big spreadsheet. And in the main, it was because people were bored of moving barbed wire around Aberystwyth or Whitby. It's like, I've got to do something different. And that was the main reason why they volunteered. I think, a question that we can come on to is, did they take all the best infantrymen out of the army? That's the big sort of accusation, really.
That would mean they're actively recruiting for the best infantrymen and not
exactly
accepting volunteers.
The thing is, we've got 80 years of long, illustrious history of the parachute regiment, and we look back down that telescope at the time in 1940, 41, 42, 43. It was all completely new. And I interviewed some veterans, and I asked them, what do you think the rest of the army thought of you? And they all said, they were kind of curious, and they thought we were a bit mad. And it was like, well, rather you than me. You know what I mean? Why would you want to do that? That was it was all very new. You're talking about Ringway Airfield. People are doing their 8 jumps. Operation Biting hasn't happened yet. February 42. It's this new thing. They're looking for keen guys. They're looking for volunteers, people who've got that volunteer spirit, and they're recruiting them in and they're getting them. But I don't think they take all the best infantrymen out of the army. I don't think there's some concerted effort to just take them all away. I mean, in my book, I have a discussion about eliteness, and I say I'm not going to go anywhere near eliteness, because they all thought they were an elite. The light infantry, the rifle brigade, the Highlanders.
Well, that's your esprit de corps, isn't it? You should have with any unit.
When they looked into forming 2 additional parachute battalions in August 41 to fill out the brigade, there was a War Office paper, and they actually stipulated that they couldn't take more than 10 other ranks from any one unit. And if you actually look at the structure of like a 41, 42 infantry battalion, if you just took the best guys out of an infantry regiment, starting with the RSM, and you took the RSM, you took all the CSMs, you took all the top guys, you still would have a considerable, enormous body of NCOs left. And obviously you'd never do that, because somebody who's an RSM in the Coldstream Guards is going to be an RSM in the Coldstream Guards going forward. They took good volunteers, they took good guys. And then later on, things changed. They had a conversion process where they converted complete units into parachute battalions. And then they backfilled those with volunteers. And then they did recruit heavily from the General Service Corps, which was formed in January 42, which General Adam created to really sort guys out when they were recruited into the army.
That's essentially you join the army. It's like a generic unit for training, isn't it?
Yeah. To be fair, they did raid some good guys out of that. And they also went through the 70 series battalions, which were the young soldier battalions. And in my book, I sort of analysed 8 parachute battalion, the Midlands battalion, and they go through the Leicesters and the Warwicks and the Northants young soldier battalions. But then all the guys that are rejected, if you like, or who don't volunteer, they are all folded back into those regiments. They go off to Tunisia or Italy, or they get ready to be involved in Overlord. I tried to find it again. It's in the Little Art Centre in KCL in London, and I've looked again and I couldn't find it. But I saw it once, a paper, and they took a load of guys out of anti-aircraft command for infantry, sort of in 43, 44, and they were really worried. It's like, oh no, you've taken all the best guys. That's it. The unit's going to fall apart. And they actually said that, like, oh, we're in a better place, because little did we know that the corporals have become better sergeants, if you know what I mean. And like everybody steps up, and it's fresher, and it's the units are better. So that's interesting. But I've looked for that. I'll have to go and have another look for that.
But Gale himself is taken away from the Airborne Brigade, isn't he, to the War Office? Why is he removed from the War? Because I think this is interesting. A part of his wartime career, and I'm not sure if he's taken away because they're feeling they're husbanding him for something else and giving him more experience. He's Deputy Director of Staff Duties. What on earth is that?
So basically what he's in charge of, he's in charge of the husbanding of air assets for the use by airborne forces and the rest of the army, effectively. He's not removed. He probably felt like he'd been removed from 1st Parachute Brigade, because I think he wanted to be in there, But I think there's two things going on. There is a sensible growth in airborne forces, because Flavel takes over. Ted Flavel, who becomes a significant figure in airborne forces as it moves forward, he takes over. So there's an opportunity to develop more sort of senior airborne officers. And then obviously Boy Brown becomes in charge of the Airborne Division. And it's all part of a development. But I think it's using the skills that he's already learned to do what is a key role in the development of all of airborne forces. And I think Brooke has an idea of what they're going to do when they go back to France. Airborne's going to be a big part of an amphibious invasion. It's what they want after they've seen what's happened with Operation Mercury. I think that's essentially it. And they know there's going to be more than one division. And there are moments when you look at the RAF records, the great rift with the RAF, which starts kind of in that early 42. I ended up reading a lot of stuff about Operation Rutter, which involved Paget, and Operation Rutter turned into Operation Jubilee. And there was a big push to use paratroopers as part of Dieppe, Operation Jubilee. And obviously there's a strong suspicion now it could have possibly been a bit of a game changer if they'd landed 2 battalions of paratroopers behind Dieppe. What might have happened then? Who knows? But it was a very extravagant operation with quite unclear objectives to my mind. But the rift starts then, and Bomber Harris obviously is trying to build up these 1,000 bomber raids, and there's literally just a competition for the use of the 4-engined bombers that Bomber Command have got. If you look at the portal papers, which Christ Church College have got at Oxford, they've got tremendous correspondence, discussions about how long it's going to take to retrain these bomber squadrons to tow gliders and to drop paratroopers. The fact that the bombers can't carry many paratroopers because it's not what they're designed for. All that stuff's going on, and this great rift takes place. And Gale is in there. He's in that discussion in the role he's got at that point. And then Boy Browning, he writes this memo, an open memorandum, effectively, in April 42 to Churchill. And Brooke is very unhappy with Browning for having done that. And he has an interview about biscuits with Browning to discuss why Browning actually did that. And then the whole thing just like sort of bursts into flames. Lord Cherwell Lindemann, Churchill's chief scientific advisor, complains about the number of gliders that are sitting at Burnaston and Kidlington that they've completed. And then there is this row about the size of how big an air landing brigade will actually be. And then it all goes off when the RAF discovers that the Army is planning to create a 2nd Airborne Division. Because it's like, it's like somebody's got hold of your credit card and has just gone mad as far as the RAF are concerned. And in the meantime, though, Bomber Command are the way that we are striking back against the Germans. It looks like the Germans are about to eliminate Russia in the summer of 1942. And there we are. And there's this big rift in November. And Gale, there's moments where Gale flashes up in the papers where in November 42, this big rift takes place. They have a big meeting. Churchill decides to freeze glider production and there'll be no further expansion of airborne forces. And the RAF would like for the Airborne Division to be disbanded. But Brooke actually says there's no way that division's going to be disbanded. And if it comes down to it, I'll turn it into a motorised light division and I'll send it to North Africa. That's what he wouldn't have disbanded it. And Gale's flashing up and he says, there's a quote from General Gale says, the situation with the RAF has become difficult regarding parachute training. So he's obviously in there trying to negotiate and talk to people like Hollinghurst. And there's people like Chatterton, who's the commander of what's going to be the glider pilot regiment. They're all in the mix as well. But it's just this terrible shortage of resources that affects British airborne forces all the way through, up to a point where in one of the meetings, Portal announces that the Americans are going to give us 700 Dakotas. And that's the end of the debate.
It's interesting. Gale's central to all these discussions, though, the War Office. It makes him a remarkably rounded character when he's given command of the 6th Airborne Division.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm a bit of obviously I'm a fan of Windy Gale. You get the feeling this is it. It's like the right job, right man, right job, right time. He knows exactly what he wants. And you start reading about the training he puts together. I mean, the division's a skeleton. They've got 3rd Parachute Brigade, which has been formed because 1st Parachute Brigade's gone to Tunisia. They've got 3rd Parachute Brigade. The filling out of the ranks of that is paralysed, really, by having to send replacements to 1st Parachute Brigade because they're suffering so many losses in Tunisia. So the division's kind of like a skeleton. It's a bit of it's kind of like a Christmas tree with no needles on it for quite a long time. What he does, he trains what he's got. He's got maybe 200 guys in each battalion, but he's training the officers and he encourages them to talk about intelligence and reconnaissance, but he keeps it really simple. And he actually says at one point, in a night, because they assume it's going to be a night operation preceding a dawn amphibious landing for the second front. So it's all going to happen in the dark. And he says, every man must know what he's doing. Every man must have one simple task to do. And that it's all about simplicity and communication and team spirit. I interviewed Nick Archdale, who was the commander of the mortar platoon of 7th Battalion. And I said to him, did you ever worry you weren't going to win? And he looked at me horrified. And he went, no. He said, we always knew we were going to win. And that's like the spirit that Gale created. They land on the night of the 5th, 6th of June. There's massive scattering. 3rd Parachute Brigade's got 33% effectives. 5th Parachute Brigade's got 60%, but they all achieve the missions. They land and they go, well, what else are we going to do? I've got nothing else planned. Let's achieve the objectives. And that's what they did. And that just goes back to Gale. It's about simplicity, communication, aggression, fitness, maximising firepower, co-opting nearby firepower of regular infantry and armoured divisions, using Royal Navy gunnery support, just maximising it, just maxing it all, really.
Does Gale create a specific unit identity for the 6th Airborne Division that's perhaps different from the 1st Airborne Division with Boy Browning? Because I think they're different characters, and they've certainly got different backgrounds.
They kind of are. I mean, the Airborne Division, which is 1st Airborne Division, I mean, the 1st Parachute Brigade is sent to Tunisia where it like fights on the line. It takes quite serious losses, very serious. And so replacements have to fill that. 2nd Parachute Brigade goes out there. The 1st Air Landing Brigade goes out there. The commander, the divisional commander, isn't Browning, it's Hoppy Hopkinson, who was the commander of 31st Independent Infantry Brigade, which became the Air Landing Brigade, which was then split into the 1st and 6th Air Landing Brigades, if you follow me. He was very effective in charge of the part of the GHQ reconnaissance unit in 1940. He's got very much a sort of aggressive kind of attitude. There's obviously a rift with Browning and Hopkinson, because when they're planning for Sicily, he deliberately avoids meeting Browning. Browning's gone out as Airborne Forces advisor to Eisenhower, effectively, for Operation Husky. And they're based at Mascara in North Africa. And like Hopkinson avoids Browning. And there's quite a chilling section in Chatterton, the Glider Pilot Regiment's commander's memoir, where Chatterton points out there's a lot of like really solid low walls in Sicily that won't be very friendly towards gliders. And effectively, Hopkinson pretty much effectively threatens to sack him from the job if he doesn't go along with it. I mean, that's Chatterton's version of events. And then Hopkinson's later killed in September 1943 in Italy. Down, who's the commander of the 2nd Parachute Brigade, he takes over briefly, but then he's sent off to India to form 44th Indian Airborne Division, which is a promotion. But I don't think Down was that impressed with that, because I think he wanted to be commander of 1st Airborne Division. And then January 44, they get Roy Urquhart, who's done very, very well with the 231st Brigade, which has been attached to 51st Highland Division during Husky. And all the Scottish troops called them Roy's Boys, because 231st Brigade were essentially West Country units. But they were like an extra infantry brigade of Wimberley's division. And they did very well. But I think that kind of swap and changing of commanding officers, the fact that the division was broken up, I don't think that helped 1st Airborne Division. And also a big thing that didn't help 1st Airborne Division is that when Browning became the commander, effectively, of British Airborne Forces, he took a lot of the staff officers from 1st Airborne Division to become part of the Corps Command. Urquhart's Arnhem memoir, I mean, there's some quite controversial sections in that. Urquhart states that 1st Airborne Division was a bit undercooked in terms of staff work and officers. And there's other bits and pieces in that book which are quite, controversial to this day when you look at the way Arnhem is enshrined in other writing. But they were very different divisions. And Gale, he grew 6th Airborne Division from absolute a tulip bulb, into this division ready for Operation Tonga and Operation Mallard. He selected all the commanders. He knew it intimately. The staff officer were his choices. Everybody knew what they had to do. They knew what their role was going to be. The bigoted officers who knew about the overall plan, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And this confidence and energy, the divisional motto was "Go to it," which sums it all up, really.
How much input did Gale have for that planning for the D-Day operation? Sometimes I get the feeling that you have units that are looking for jobs that create jobs for themselves to prove their worth, and sometimes they're handed jobs to be done. How much does Gale have on what's happening with that planning process?
Alan Brooke had fought tooth and nail for Airborne Forces. So there's no way that Airborne Forces weren't going to be involved in D-Day. No way. Dempsey was very enthusiastic about Airborne Forces. He appreciated that idea, that kind of Robert Kershaw idea, the vertical envelopment. The open flank is above. We can pour guys onto them, then they're stuffed. And also, you've got to bear in mind there's the experience of earlier in 44. They've had these terrible battles trying to cross rivers in Italy, like the Rapido and the Garigliano. And then, of course, you've got Anzio. There's no airborne troops used at Anzio, and that went well. There is this enthusiasm, and it's like reinforcing the point again and again. But then when you look at the planning, I mean, obviously they were woven tightly into the Neptune Overlord plan with their responsibilities on the eastern flank. But I think once it was kind of like that was set, I think Gale had a tremendous amount of control over the actual plan. And of course, he's got that relationship with Hollinghurst. And they've got 38 Group and 46 Group at this point, RAF, which they formed very quickly out of coastal command squadrons. And, with the Dakotas, so they're ready to go. There's a shift in the planning, which takes place in April 44, when they realise that the Germans are planting the stakes, the Rommel asparagus. Because initially he wanted to use the Air Landing Brigade instead of 3rd parachute brigade. The air landing brigade would be able to land more concentrated through a massive coup de main centred around the bridges. But obviously the stakes meant that wasn't going to be possible. So they had to swap out 3rd Parachute Brigade for 6th Air Landing. There's a tremendous amount of stuff in the war diary for 6th Airborne Division at Kew, and they all rewrite their appreciations. Hill writes appreciation for it, and then obviously 6th Air Landing is in Mallard, goes into the big Tuesday night drop. But I think he had a tremendous control over it. I think Gale did. But, like the main man, Alan Brooke, is in full support. Dempsey's enthusiastic. Montgomery thinks it's a great idea. Bradley, on the other side of the landings, he actually says at one point he's prepared to take 75% losses of American airborne as long as the amphibious troops get ashore. So they're all ready to go.
Andrew, we're going to pause it there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Andrew Wheale, and we're discussing Windy Gale and the 6th Airborne Division. Is it possible then to measure the success of 6th Airborne Division on D-Day? It's not just D-Day, they're there till they're there into Normandy into August. I always think it's interesting when you think about Airborne, because the popular idea is really Pegasus Bridge. Everything after that kind of gets hand waved away. How successful do they felt they were in comparison to the training that they've been given?
I mean, effectively, what they did, they landed. There's this key battle they fight on the 12th of June at the Battle of Wheale, which is quite notable and sort of celebrated. They create this composite unit effectively out of the D Company of the Devon glider troops and what's left of 12th Battalion, and they capture this village, which is a real bulge in the line. And if anybody ever visits the Normandy battlefields, if you go to Wheale, it's this sleepy hamlet. If you stand in the field, you can actually see Sword Beach. They were really fearful that the Germans were going to mass there and actually use it as like a stepping off point for a quite serious attack. Effectively, they straightened that part out of the line, and then the German corps commander in that sector actually requests if he can withdraw to the Dive, which is some way back, the River Dive. And that really freezes the eastern flank, and then they just dig in for the next 3 months. And they are quite short of men. They're short of manpower. But it's interesting the forces that Gale ends up with under his command, which is he ends up with 2 commando brigades, the Belgian Infantry Brigade, the Prince Irene Dutch Brigade, as well as 6th Airborne Division. So although it's part of First Corps, which is part of the Canadians, eventually it's almost like a baby corps that Gale's got, and there's certainly a lack of heavy equipment, and a unit that rushes around is the 13th, 18th Hussars with their Sherman tanks, who spend a lot of their time at that stage with 6th Airborne Division. But they hold that flank and they freeze it, and they do a lot with like aggressive patrolling in that sort of broken up landscape of like woods and hills on the eastern flank. Not a great deal goes on, but then that's good, because all the action obviously has gone down to the Odon Valley, capturing Caen and pushing out in that direction with those big operations like Goodwood and Epsom and all the rest of it. They do a job because they've got very little mobility, because they've got no vehicles effectively. What they can do is dig in and hold the ground. There's an interesting bit in the war diary about Goodwood, because Goodwood effectively kicks off from their part of the world, their bridgehead. And Gale watches Goodwood go off effectively, and they have got a plan that if Goodwood works, 6th Airborne is going to steam out of their bridgehead and try and capture Cabourg, which is the next port along in the coast. But I think they do a good job for 3 months, considering they've taken sort of fairly significant losses and they hold that ground. I think they do what's asked of them.
It's interesting you mentioned Goodwood, because I think you make this point about Monty having an idea of creating colossal cracks with massive use of artillery and air power, and these cracks would then be exploited. But that somehow doesn't really fit in with sort of the coup de main operation that the Airborne would do, because it's not got that sort of softening up period. They're not part of that softening up period from Monty's doctrine.
I think Montgomery viewed airborne forces as sort of a special effect to his main scheme of operations, but they were very useful. If you look at the scenery, if you look at that area in Normandy, that area between the River Orne and the River Dive, all that worked in out. We were able to seize that overnight. We effectively seized that in the night, and we demolished the bridges over the Dive. The Germans had a 6-hour detour around the bridgehead to get from one side of Caen to the other, and we managed to freeze that side of the bridgehead, and it all worked in our favour because we used this airborne division to seize that objective. And I think it fitted in. It was like, it was another aspect of air power to an extent. I think as far as Montgomery was concerned, it was a special added ingredient for a really sort of significant offensive. His colossal cracks methodology was to view all the 25 pounders. If you look at it, Montgomery encouraged his commanders to look at all the 25 pounders in an infantry division, not as 3 regiments of 24 guns, but to look at them as one big battery of 72, and to just throw that weight. And it's all about sort of throwing weight and momentum at the enemy. And I think Montgomery did view them as that kind of sort of special added ingredient.
I wonder if that's at odds with how Gale views war, and I think this comes back to sort of keeps coming up with that last 100 days, where Gale views Airborne differently to Montgomery and gets this idea perhaps of initiative, of fast moving, keeping up the pressure, and that's different to Monty's controlling the battlefield, which goes back to perhaps their First World War experiences.
I think there is like a bridge you can draw between Gale and Montgomery, in that I think Gale was so focused on communication and planning and training and good leadership at every level, because I think he knew that once 6th Airborne Division was launched, it would kind of work or it wouldn't. I mean, he had a very effective small divisional HQ set up by 3 a.m. in the morning at Wheale. There's nowhere it can withdraw to. If it goes a bit wrong, like Goodwood, we can't go back to the bridgehead and we're going to have to fall back. That hasn't worked. You can't do that if you've got an airborne division. So Gale had planned and prepared his division to do really well on its operation. And I think that does tie in with Montgomery's thinking, planning, preparation, training. Because basically Gale's got one turn of the card, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, but is Gale not training to deal with the fog of war rather than control it? Gale's training his men to expect it to not fail, that's not what I mean, but to not be as they're expecting. And that's his anticipation. So he trains his men to deal with chaos rather than control the battlefield. He'll say, whatever happens won't be what you expect. And that's the nub of his training. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it's an aspect of my book. I mean, it's like Gale just managed to extract sort of control out of the chaos and haphazard nature of airborne operations. Yes, he does. I mean, he trains his guys to be ready for anything, as the divisional motto, go to it. They're just ready. They know what they've got to do. It's like, we're going to land and we've got to blow that little bridge up. Whatever we do, we've got to blow that little bridge up. And then we have to fall back to this point where hopefully our friends will be. And hopefully, some hours later, we'll hear some bagpipes. And that's kind of the ethos. And coming back to that interview I did with Nick Archdale, he told me something quite extraordinary, which is he ended up with this odds and sods group defending the village of Laporte, which is just to the north of Pegasus Bridge. And they got cut off for a time, and they were being attacked so hard by the Germans that were counterattacking them, they actually thought that the seaborne landings might have failed because the Germans were coming on so strong. I didn't actually ask him the question, but from inferring from what he was saying, they were obviously prepared just to stand there and keep fighting the Germans till whenever. And in the end, they were sort of relieved by the Royal Warwicks later that evening, and they were actually concerned about being killed by the Royal Warwicks, and they were actually waving their maroon berets out the window so the Warwicks would see them. And I think it's that spirit. I mean, they were prepared for anything. It's all about planning, preparation, leader selection. That was it.
This is where I struggle to almost, no, I don't mean to square the circle, that colossal cracks is imposing on the order on the battlefield, where Gale doesn't, just accepts there is no order on the battlefield. And that's the genius of that kind of idea of that training, which is almost at odds with what the rest of the army is doing with this colossal cracks. We will impose order, we will roll forward. And they're kind of like, well, we can't do that because we're on our road, so you need to understand. And it's almost reminiscent of how the Germans are dealing with the chaos when the boot's on the other foot for them.
I see what you're getting at, but I mean, I think my definition of combat effectiveness in my book was, effectively, it's about, for airborne forces, it's about achieving the objective, but not suffering such Pyrrhic losses that you can't hold the position. That was my definition.
Which is what the Germans do, usually. Their big Pyrrhic victories repeatedly.
Yeah. But I mean, for 6th Airborne Division, it was about the objective, objective for each battalion and the objective of holding that side of the river and the canal. He trained them to do it, and and all sorts of strange and wonderful things happened once they've landed. And I think they managed to knit together again as a division. I mean, when I actually wrote the DPhil, I discovered Napier Crookenden in his Drop Zone Normandy book had written that Gale had been seen riding around on a white horse. But I thought that just sounds ridiculous. But then there's other references to it, and like Gale refers to in his memoir, there is this unity of command and there is this collective understanding of what the objectives are. There are people like Nick Archdale, his mortar platoon, effectively, I think it lost all its mortars. And so his guys just armed themselves with whatever there was. And they said, right, we'll defend. And they were told by Point Coffin, the commander of 7th Battalion, just defend the port, just defend it. And they did. But it all goes back to Gale's planning and preparation, which again, for me, is perhaps that bridge with Montgomery.
I'm always intrigued about this idea with Montgomery, and I just thought the whole Gale thing about how he viewed the battlefield as really interesting. And again, comes back to those First World War experiences. Because Monty, I think, is a staff officer by 1918, isn't he?
Oh yeah, he got badly wounded early on, hadn't he?
Yeah, he's not necessarily there. He's doing a different job to Gale in that right at the very end. And I'm really intrigued at how that all fits together. And as I say, it was a bit of a light bulb moment when I'm reading about how Gale's training and ideas on training and putting it all together. You think, that's interesting. That's not necessarily the way that I thought it was. They were imprinting training on people.
I mean, Gale kind of trained 3 subjects. He trained infantry fighting, and they actually did some house-to-house fighting training in the rubble at Southampton. Then he did training on bridges, and quite a lot of the units in 6th Airborne Division knew how to mend and build little bridges in case the bridges they captured were wrecked. But then he also did this thing which he called the anti-tank hedgehog, because he knew that if the Germans seriously attacked them, it would probably be mechanised. And he'd train those 3 subjects, if you like, over and over. Because it's like, well, we'll have to fight Germans with infantry weapons. There might be an issue with bridges. And then if the Germans really have a go, it will involve panzers and half tracks. And he just trained that over and over. And he was absolutely right. There was a section of the sort of 6th Air Landing Brigade area, which they actually called the tank killing ground, because he'd identified this big flat area in the south, down towards Colombelle near Caen, which was really wide open. So he said, well, it looks like the Germans are going to they will probably try and push tanks across that because it's really good tank country. So he said, well, we'll turn it into a tank killing ground then, because he had all these 6-pounders with the Air Landing Brigade. Very simple. I mean, if you read the Call to Arms memoir, he says the great threat to infantry is what he called the unlocated machine gun, which was from his experience in World War One. If you suddenly start getting hit by an unlocated enemy machine gun, that's horrendous. And then, of course, he's in the machine gun corps. He won the MC for breaking up an enemy attack with machine guns. And I wonder how many of those were unlocated, as far as the Germans were concerned. And then, interestingly, on the 7th and 8th of June, I think it's 12 and 13 battalions break up German attacks coming across Drop Zone N. And their Vickers machine guns played quite a part in that. There's this echoes, which, you can imagine him sort of visiting the units and wanting to see the Vickers, I bet he did.
The other thing that amused me about Gale is clearly jodhpurs were more masculine and cool in 1940s than they are now, because he's got all the look, and then the jodhpurs, I always think, slightly let him down. Well,
it's sartorial elegance, isn't it? I mean, it's very interesting. It's very interesting when you get into uniforms, because if you go to the Parachute Regiment Museum at Duxford, they've got Browning designed for himself an Uhlan jacket, an airborne button up at the side, sort of Baron von Richthofen Uhlan jacket, which I think I'm always slightly suspicious of people who start designing their own uniforms. It's all very well having a hat with 2 badges on it, I think, but when people are starting to follow the path of George Armstrong Custer, I am slightly worried. But I think old Windy Gale, he's obviously happy in his jodhpurs. Again, it's part of that interesting, strange thing that he does, where he's a bit of a chameleon, because there is a photograph of him looking very dapper in his Eisenhower style uniform with his red tabs, and then there's photographs of him when he meets Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen, and he's wearing quite a strange get-up there because he's wearing like his number one jacket, he's wearing his maroon beret, and he's wearing his jodhpurs again. These look like quite smart sort of beige jodhpurs. So, that's his obviously meeting Princess Elizabeth outfit,
They look slightly odd because he has ammunition boots on and not sort of riding boots, which I think makes him look a bit peculiar.
Well, we won't hold it against him.
No, it just makes me chuckle because I did a search on the Imperial War Museum website of pictures of him out of curiosity because it's the same handful comes up. And I was curious to see, because the IWM often, people are just lazy and they take the first page of pictures as illustrations. And actually, the IWM, the only ones that turned up were the same usual pictures. And I was quite surprised. And it's sort of Denison smock, jodhpurs, ammunition boots, or there's the one where he's stood outside, fag in his hand, looking like sort of some weird Harry Enfield sort of character. Looking slightly bemused, and the photographs somehow don't seem to do the man and his reputation. It's not as if he's curated his reputation through his photographs, where you got the feeling that Boyd Browning was doing a very good job of curating what he perceived to be his reputation through his photographs.
Oh, yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's interesting that a lot of the pictures he's not wearing anything on his head. And I wonder whether that's so people can see it's him. There's possibly some psychology there where, I'm a big bloke. I'm not going to wear anything on my head because I'm going to stand in a room full of people wearing maroon berets and steel helmets. If I've got nothing on my head, they'll all know it's me. And because you've got to bear in mind, if you actually look at 6th Airborne Division before D-Day, the number of men who've actually seen combat is really small. Officers, there's not that many men who've actually seen action for the important job that they're going to do. You'd possibly be concerned.
That might fill, is it Lord Moran's well of Kerridge? They've still got a full well to draw upon when they're scattered and lost all over Normandy to actually get up and hold those positions and crack on.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the idea that people have only got so much, was it 60 hours? Some very low number before you've had enough.
It's a difficult one. I'm sure everyone's well is of a different depth. It's probably the best way to put it. As we stray for the topic, we should perhaps leave it there. Thanks. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about Windy Gale, Andrew's book is Ham and Jam, 6th Airborne Division in Normandy, Generating Combat Effectiveness, November 1942, September 1944. As a nod to the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden this year, I'm hoping to discuss the film A Bridge Too Far for the next episode. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.